Hey guys, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Becca and today I have my December wrap up. So December, I feel, was a very busy month for a lot of people. I know I was incredibly busy in December, but from Twitter, I feel like it was the same for everybody, and I don't remember it being this hectic last year. So yes, December was incredibly busy, but I actually didn't do too bad with my reading. I mean, if we're comparing how much I read in December to how much I read over the majority of the beginning of this year, then I didn't do great, but I did do a little bit better than I have the past 2 months. Especially when you take into account the fact that, strangely, I haven't read a single page in a week. So in December, I did manage to read 6 books. As usual, I will be reviewing the books in the order that I read them, but first, let us get to my reading stats. So in the month of December, I read 2,393 pages, which broke down to an average of 77 pages per day. For my ratings, I had 1 3-star book, 3 4-star books and 1 5-star book, which broke down to an average of 4 stars per book. For the demographics, I read 4 adult books and 2 young adult. For the formats, I read 5 physical books and 1 manga. For the genres, I read 2 dystopian, 2 fantasy, 1 contemporary and 1 science fiction. And for the places where I sourced these books from, 2 of the books I read I have hauled in 2019. 2 of the books came from my own TBR that existed before the start of 2019, and 2 of the books I read were library books. So jumping straight into the reviews, the first book that I finished in December was The Mime Order by Samantha Shannon. This is the second book in the Bone Season series. There are 3 books published so far of an eventual 7, and I am reading this because I am a co-host for the Bonathon, which is a read-along of the first 3 books in this series that is hosted by Ashley from A Frolic Through Fiction. So the Bone Season series is about clairvoyancy in a futuristic London where to be clairvoyant is illegal. We follow our main character, Paige Mahoney, who is the second in command to one of the most influential crime gangs in London, and you guessed it, she's also a clairvoyant. So one day when Paige is on the train to go and see her father, she reveals that she has clairvoyant powers, and she is then captured and taken away to be hanged. We quickly find out that she isn't actually going to be hanged, and that London has been hiding this secret location where all sorts of strange things are happening. That's pretty much all I like to say about this, because the place where Paige goes is not necessarily a spoiler because it happens pretty early on in the book, but there isn't really a mention of it in the synopsis, and I was completely surprised the first time I read this book. So as you may have guessed, this was a reread for me. I did give this one 5 stars, but it was more like a 4.5. The first book in this series very much focuses on the place where Paige is taken and all of the things that are going on there, whereas this book focuses more on the criminal underground of London, where all the clairvoyants have banded into these gangs for survival because their very existence is considered criminal by the government. There are a lot of things I really enjoy about this book and this series. One of my favorite things about this series is just how compelling it is. These books are so easy to binge. The first 100 or so pages of this one was a little bit slow for me, but when I got past like the 100-150 mark, I flew through the rest of this book. In this, we learn a lot more about the 7 Seals, which is Paige's gang, and I really like the dynamics as a group, and also the dynamics of this criminal London underground, where there is a lot of corruption because they are criminals, but a lot of them have to be criminals because there's no other real justifiable way for clairvoyants to make a living in this world. So the dynamics and the power struggles in this book are really quite interesting. I will put a link in my description box to the live show on this if you would like to hear us talk about it more in depth, because we really go into specific incidences in that live show. But the reason why this is a 4.5 and not a 5 to me is that I felt like there were things that could have been more developed. Weird, because when I was reading them, I kept feeling like there were plot holes, and I don't think that there are plot holes in this. It's just sometimes things will happen and I feel like they need a little bit more development and a little bit more backstory on them. I really like this series, so I wasn't going into it trying to find flaws with it, but there were just a couple of scenes where I was thinking like, wait a minute, why is this happening? What is this? This doesn't make sense. Another very minor issue that I had with this is that the transitions between scenes sometimes felt very clunky, but aside from that, I really love this book. I really love this series, and I would recommend this one if you haven't checked it out and you like complex sci-fi dystopian fantasy type books. The second book I read in December was A Dance with Dragons Part 2, After the Feast by George R.R. Martin. This is the second half of the most recently published book in the A Song of Ice and Fire series. I did read the first half in November, so I will link my November wrap-up up here if you want to hear more about that. But this book was also the final book for my book club's read along of the A Song of Ice and Fire series, so I will link the live show for A Dance with Dragons in the description box below as well. So if you are unfamiliar with the A Song of Ice and Fire series, it is the series of books that Game of Thrones is based on. This is a very complex plot and a complex world, and I don't really like to tell you what the series is actually about because there is a very pivotal point at the end of the first book which kicks off what the bulk of this series is about, and to tell you the plot of this would be to spoil that first book. But in this series we mainly follow the most powerful houses in Westeros as they are battling for control of the country. This series is very heavy on the political fantasy aspects, but we do have the more magical fantasy aspects like dragons, white walkers, fire gods, priestesses, prophecies and things like that. So I gave this one 4 stars, and I'm kind of sad about that because when I read the first half of Dance with Dragons, that was my favorite book in the series so far. Now if we smush the 2 books together, then that would give the whole Dance with Dragons book a 4.5 rating overall, but that first half of this book was so compelling and so interesting, and I'm a little bit disappointed in the second half. The reason that I like the first half so much is that it had a lot of the magical aspects. As I said, this series is predominantly a political fantasy and it takes a long time for the magical aspects to come in. Now, A Dance with Dragons Part 1 solely focused on the characters with magical abilities, so all of the magic of the world was in that book and I was living for it. Now, A Dance with Dragons does run parallel to A Feast for Crows, and the reason that the second half of this book is called After the Feast because this is the point where the 2 timelines converge. So in A Feast for Crows we mainly follow the political half of the world, and then in A Dance with Dragons Part 1 we are following the magical characters in the world at the same time as the events of A Feast for Crows. In this book the timelines come together, and so we have a mix of all of those characters, and I felt like after how much I loved the first half, I just wasn't as impressed with this half when all of the characters I wasn't as interested in came back. Now I believe that this book was published in 2011 and we still don't have the Winds of Winter. The books are different from the TV show, however the TV show does follow the books quite closely up until I would say the 3rd book. Things start to diverge a tiny bit, but when we get to the 4th and 5th book we are opening like whole new plot lines that just aren't in the show. To be honest, reading the series has been a long haul, but at this point I am so invested in the story because there are characters in here that are really pivotal that don't exist in the show, and so there are a lot of things that are happening in these later books that I'm just desperate to know the outcome of. However, I am really glad that I read this series. I've gotten so much out of this. I love the myth and the lore and the legend and the things that you just don't get out of the show. So even though reading this series was a struggle in parts, I'm so glad that I managed to knock this series off my own TBR this year. The 3rd book that I read in December was a manga. I have lent it to Ashley from A Frolic Through Fiction, so I don't have it to show you guys, but that was I Want to Eat Your Pancreas. This was a gift from Kelsey, so thank you so much Kelsey for gifting me this manga because I actually really enjoyed it. So what I've discovered quite recently is that my favorite type of manga is shoujo manga that deals with dark or sad topics. This particular book is a bind-up of the I Want to Eat Your Pancreas series, and in this series we follow a boy who is very introverted, he has no friends, and he very much keeps to himself. Now one day he is at the hospital having stitches removed, and when he is leaving he walks through the waiting room and he sees a book lying abandoned on a seat. He picks the book up, he opens it, and he finds out that it is actually the diary of a girl who is in his class. And the interesting thing about this diary is that it chronicles this girl's terminal illness. The girl is essentially the polar opposite of our male main character in that she is very popular and she is very outgoing. Now, this terminal illness that she has had for most of her life, she has kept a secret from everybody apart from her family. So when the main character finds out that she has it, she kind of latches onto him because she finds it quite refreshing that she can be around somebody in a friendship capacity that knows what she is going through. So I really enjoyed this story. I gave gave it 4 stars overall. The reason I didn't give it a full 5 stars is that I didn't get like the full emotional impact from it. It didn't make me cry or anything. This book starts out the day after the girl's funeral, so straight off going into this you do know that she has already died, and then the bulk of the story is recounting the friendship up until her death. Now, one of the reasons I didn't give it 5 stars is that I wish their relationship had developed further. In the synopsis for this book, it does say that it is a love story, but I felt like I would have liked to see more of their relationship before the girl died. The thing about the main character is that he is so relatable if you are an introvert. There were points throughout this book that were so funny because he's so blunt, but it's also so true. Like, some of the things that he will say is that he will flat out say to people when they ask him why he's always on his own, he says he's just not interested in people, he prefers to read books. And I don't know about you guys, but I can definitely relate to that. After also reading Orange this year, I had a feeling that this type of manga was my preferred type of manga, but this has really cemented that for me, and so I am now on the lookout for any recommendations of shoujo manga that deal with sad or dark topics. I have been gifted a few over the festive period, but if you do have any recommendations for that type of manga, then please put them in the comments down below. The next book that I read was I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. So this was my first classic science fiction read, so I had no idea what to expect when I was going into this, but I really loved it. So in this book we follow Robert Neville, and he is the last man alive in a apocalyptic world that has been ravaged by a vampiric plague. Now, as you may have guessed, this is the book that the movie starring Will Smith is based on. However, they are very different while being very similar at the same time. If you wondered if you should read this book before watching the movie, then I would say that you can do either at any time, because they are both different enough that you will get a different experience from each one. So Robert Neville is the last man alive, and this is an interesting story because I feel like the main focus of this is humanity and survival, and just the struggle of Robert Neville trying to survive in a world where there are no other humans. This world has been taken over by vampires, and vampires in this are not like the vampires that we typically know. There are elements of vampiric tradition and mythology in here, but this is a very scientific based novel as well, and there is obviously a danger there. However, the main issues that Robert faces in this book are actually loneliness and hopelessness. Robert literally has nobody to talk to. The vampiric plague has also affected a lot of dogs. There's not really any mention of other animals in here, but it is assumed that this disease is not just limited to humans. So Robert has had no interaction with any living creature for the longest time. This book was honestly difficult to read in parts because you can only imagine what this guy is going through, and I thought it was interesting how this book took the perspective of a very human problem in this apocalyptic world that features a supernaturally enemy. I do say that vampires are supernatural, but one of the things that I really loved about this book is that it takes a very scientific standpoint. Now, I'm a very logic-minded person, and one of the main plot threads in this book is that in absence of any human connection or anything to really do, Robert starts to pursue the cause of the plague and look for a possible cure. As I said, there are elements of vampiric mythology in this book, but Robert really delves into the science behind why steaks and garlic affect the vampires, and doing things like running experiments. Some of it did go over my head as there was a lot of technical jargon, but I did still understand enough of it to be completely fascinated by this book. For those of you like myself who are sensitive to such topics, yes, there is a dog in here, but no, it is not the same situation as it is in the movie, so I think you're gonna be okay. I did give this book 4 stars, not a full 5, because the way that this book ends, I like more than I like the way the movie ends. However, right at the end, the world kind of opens up a bit, and there is so much possibility of where the story could have gone, and it's just not explored. Now, I do understand why, because this is quite an isolated perspective that we're following, and it is supposed to focus on the more human aspects than it is on the world and what's going on, but there just could have been so much more at the end of this. I then read Beneath the Sugar Sky by Shauna Maguire, and this was my lowest rated book of the month, as I gave this one 3 stars. This is the 3rd book in the Wayward Children series, series, which is a series of novellas that all follow different places and different aspects in the same world. So in the first book in this series, Every Heart a Doorway, we are in Eleanor West's Home for Wayward Children, which is a care home for children who have come back from portal worlds and feel like they don't belong in the real world. Now, the first book in this series does exclusively take place in the real world, and it is a murder mystery type plot. The second book takes place in a portal world, and it is a prequel that follows two of the characters from the first novella. And the third book takes place both at Eleanor West's Home for Wayward Children and various portal worlds, and it follows some characters that have been present the entire series and a couple of new ones. Now, the plot of this book is that we follow two of the children who are trying to help a girl that has fallen out of the sky and come to ask them for help because she is slowly disappearing, because the actions of some of the characters in the first book have altered the future and the portal world that this girl comes from. Now, there were things that I really enjoyed about this book. The main one would be the portal world that the majority of this story takes place in, which is a Candyland. Now, there are different types of portal worlds. There are high logic, there's high nonsense, but this world was a nonsense world that was rooted in reason, and I felt like I really enjoyed that because a lot of things were kind of told in nonsensical riddles in a way that didn't obviously make sense, but if you thought about it a lot, you could kind of get the sense out of it. And I thought that that was really clever, especially because there are lots of different combinations. Like, you could have a high logic world that isn't rooted in reason and things like that. So I really like the way that Shauna Maguire is portraying these different combinations through her writing in the various books. Now, the main reason that I gave this 3 stars is that I really enjoyed reading it, but I don't think this story will stick with me. I read most of this in one sitting, sat listening to one of the Harry Potter ASMR rooms, and I had a great time and I loved the atmosphere. I do really like Shauna Maguire's writing, but the story overall I just don't think is very memorable to me, and when I closed this book I was already forgetting some of the things that happened in it. All of Shauna Maguire's books in this series are very diverse, and we follow different characters of different identities across this entire series. Now, the main rep that we have in this one is trans rep and fat rep, and one of the things that I liked about the 2 previous installments in this series is that the diversity felt quite seamless and it didn't feel like I was being hit over the head by the messages portrayed in the book. However, in this one I don't think that the fat rep was portrayed all that well. I feel like the portrayal was really quite accurate. I just felt like I was constantly being reminded that this character was fat. Every time the character did something, the reader wasn't left to come to their own conclusion whether she did this thing or felt this thing because of her self-image. It was told to us every single time. For example, quite near the beginning of the book, she crashes into somebody. It says something about how she was just waiting for them to call her fat because she crashed into somebody. And at the beginning, like, okay, setting up the scene and the character and how the character feels about their body image, but every single time something happens, it was told to the reader that it was because she was fat and because people had called her fat in the past. And I just felt like it was a little bit heavy-handed and unnecessary. But overall, I did quite enjoy this one, and I will be continuing on to the next book in the series. And then the final book I read in 2019 was The Toll by Neil Shusterman. Now, at this point, I don't feel like I really need to remind you guys that this was my second most anticipated release of the year. However, I didn't give this 5 stars. So if you are unfamiliar with what this book is, it is the 3rd book in the Arc of a Scythe series, which is a young adult utopian series which takes place in a world where humanity has conquered death. Now, while humanity may have conquered death, they have not conquered population control. The majority of the world is governed by the Thunderhead, which is this all-knowing, all-powerful, benevolent AI. However, the Thunderhead did not feel like it should have the power to control life and death, so the Scythedom was created, and the job of the Scythedom is to decide who lives and dies and to glean people. Now, while the rest of the world is ticking on merrily under the control of the Thunderhead, there is a lot of corruption in the Scythedom because the individual sides have pretty much free reign to do whatever they want. Now, in the first book in this series, we do follow Citra and Rowan, who are becoming apprentice scythes. However, not far into Scythe, we find out that Citra and Rowan are on very different paths, and we kind of follow both of of them as they are exploring two different faces of the Scythedom. Now, I gave this 4 stars and I'm still really torn about it. Now, in the beginning of this book, the timeline isn't linear, and I understand why, because after the events at the end of Thunderhead, there was a lot to catch up on, a lot of repercussions of the main event at the end of Thunderhead. If this timeline would have been linear, the main characters would have been absent for a very long time. Because of that, Neil Shusterman has decided to rearrange the timelines a little bit, so we are following different characters all over the world at different points in time across a 3-year period after the event at the end of Thunderhead. Now, this made it a little bit confusing because in this world, years are not numbered, they are named. So it was hard to really understand what was happening when, because we didn't have that numerical year to mentally organize the timeline with. So that leads to a confusing start, but I understand why he did it. My biggest criticism of this book, which is not necessarily a criticism, and I'm really torn about it, is that this series became more about the world than it did about the characters. Throughout the entirety of this book, one of the main characters that has been there from the very start of the series is irrelevant. They are off around the world, they're doing stuff, but none of it matters. Not one thing that that character does has anything to do with the end game of this book. The other main character is kind of doing stuff, but I feel like the kind of things that the character is doing is to reveal something to the reader that links to the end and has something to do with a conflict. But if that didn't happen, the book still could have been cohesive. And then the final conflict, there wasn't really one. It felt really unsatisfying the way the conflict at the end of this went down and what happened with the main villain. I don't know how to feel about this. And the reason that I don't know how to feel about this is because the thing I love the most about this series is the world. And so it becoming more about the world than the characters didn't make it unenjoyable for me, because I care more about the world than the characters. This is a plot-driven story, not a character-driven story. It just felt really weird. I guess the overarching message of this book and this series is that the bigger picture was more important than the individual characters, and in that way it makes perfect sense. It was just a little bit unsatisfying, you know? So I feel like my issue with this book is not that it was bad, it's just I wasn't satisfied because of the way that a lot of the character arcs were wrapped up wasn't as big and dramatic, as monumental as I wanted them to be. That being said, I absolutely loved the ending of this book. It was very cinematic. I'm not somebody who enjoys action scenes in books, but I think Neil Shusterman is excellent at writing them. It was really cinematic, it was super dramatic, and I think that this series has huge potential to be a TV show. When I got over the way that this book ended, something that I also really liked about it is that the way that it ended meant that there was no chosen one, and I felt like that was very realistic, because in life we don't often have that one person who has the power to do the most amazing things. It is generally a combination of smaller actions by a large group of people, and so I did like that representation in here. So to conclude, I gave this 4 stars. I loved a lot about it. Some things I feel like I didn't like, but then I'm not sure. And yeah, this whole book just left me confused. So that is it for my December wrap up. Those are the last 6 books that I read in 2019. I hope you guys are already having a great start to your 2020. And I know that I, for one, don't particularly like to look back. I look forward. But please let me know what you guys read in December and whether you found a new favorite. Please also don't forget to like this video if you liked it and subscribe if you want to. If you head to my description box, you'll find links to my Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as a link to my Bookish body butter and candle website, the Instagram for that, and a 10% off discount code. That's it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you'll go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.